All right, why don't we begin? My name is Elliot Cohen. I'm Dean of SAIS, and it's a real pleasure to welcome an old friend, Ambassador Dennis Ross. We're here for the annual Bernstein Forum, and I want to express our gratitude to the Bernstein family who've enabled us to bring some really quite extraordinary speakers here. As Ambassador Ross was pointing out, he knows all of them, which tells you something. What we're going to do is have a conversation between the two of us for 20, 30 minutes, and then we'll have a somewhat comparable period of Q&A, and then adjourn to for book signing. And the topic of the conversation is a brand new book, just out, by Ambassador Ross and David Makovsky, who, among other things, has been a adjunct professor here at SAIS, called Be Strong and of Good Courage, How Israel's Important Leaders Shaped Its Destiny. But I thought I'd begin, Dennis, just by getting you to talk a little bit about yourself. You and I met quite a few years ago.
Yes.
I vividly remember we took a trip together into East Berlin when that was a bit of an adventure. And we've been in touch ever since. You've had quite an extraordinary career, which has spanned both Republican and Democratic administration. So I was wondering if you just want to begin with a brief biography or autobiography.
Okay. Well, so it's true. I think we actually were in East Berlin in 1985. So this is while the Cold War was still on, and I had been in the government starting in 1977 in the Pentagon. My first position was actually in the Office of PA&E, Program Analysis and Evaluation. I don't want to fall victim to the Washington disease of everything as an acronym. But so that was actually the office that was originally created by McNamara, the Office of Systems Analysis. It became Program Analysis and Evaluation. I was one of the very few political scientists who was actually hired in there, and I went from there to the Office of Net Assessment in the Pentagon, and I was in the government for about 7 years, and then sort of felt the lure of academia. I was sort of trained as an academic. I went back to Berkeley for 2 years, and then at that point was asked to, in '86, was asked to become the senior Middle East person at the National Security Council staff, and even though I said to my wife, well, how about I just take a leave from Berkeley and we can be bi-coastal, and she said, no, we can go be on one coast or we can be on the other coast, but we're not going back and forth between the two. And I pretty much, I pretty much stayed in the government until the end of the Clinton administration. In the first Bush administration, I was the head of policy planning in the State Department, where under Jim Baker, who ran the department through a kind of small coterie of aides, I was one of those small coterie, and had a kind of broader responsibility for, at that time, the Soviet Union and the Middle East, and it kept me off the streets. But I was I was with him in terms of working on the unification of Germany and NATO. It was interesting that we had been there in East Berlin and sort of seen things a couple years before the real change. And then I was in this position where I could help play a role in managing the change. What ended up happening, I also played a major role in terms of working for him and shaping the Madrid conference, which really ended kind of diplomacy through denial between the Arabs and Israelis. Was asked to stay initially just in a transitional way when Clinton came in. It was a little odd because when Baker had gone to the White House, he brought me with him, and at the time I said, but look, I'm actually a Democrat, so you really want me to go to the White House and, in the midst of this election? And he said, yes, if I have to go, you have to go, which was an interesting way of looking at it. And I was then asked to become the negotiator under Clinton on the Arab-Israeli issues. And so I stayed through the Clinton administration. I left at the end of the Clinton administration, and then was asked to come back into the Obama administration. I stayed there for 3 years. And under Obama, I had a broader responsibility as related to the broader Middle East. It was really during the Bush administration where I had responsibility, as I said, that related more to East-West issues and not only Middle Eastern issues. And I was actually trained more as a Sovietologist, but I always had this sort of, and by the way, I like to say, a lot of people obviously have deep misgivings about Putin. And the only thing I can say is he's made my training relevant again. So I have a somewhat different view towards him, although it isn't a charitable one. But in a sense, I had this kind of East-West background, but I was also, for those here who know anything about some of the leading lights in terms of Middle East scholarship, I was Malcolm Kerr's teaching assistant for 3 years. And Malcolm Kerr was probably the dean of the American Arabists. For those of you who follow basketball, his son is the coach of the Gold State Warriors. And I used to bring the Blue Books to their house, and there was this little blonde-haired kid who could never miss. And I thought, I should probably play him one-on-one now while I could still have a chance to beat him. Anyway, so that's, I had this kind of role of being a political appointee for 2 Republican presidents and 2 Democratic presidents, and I think that probably makes me an extinct species.
Yeah, yes. And it used to be not uncommon at all.
Right. I think it is interesting that you say that, Elliot, because I remember during the transition after Bush lost, Bush wrote me a note, and he said, "I really hope that you will stay." And he said, "I don't want your sense of loyalty to me to in any way affect your thinking. You will be serving me well and what I believe in if President Clinton, if President-elect asks you to stay and you agree to stay." Yeah. That was really a kind of mindset. And the first time I met Clinton, for him, he also said, it was good that I agreed to stay, because this is the way things should work.
This is kind of painful because it seems like something from, it was from a different century, I suppose, but in the technical sense. But that seems like an approach and an attitude that's.
Just one other point I'll make on that. It's interesting.
Not with us.
Because of that era really was different, and obviously on the Hill there were many more centrists, and there were people on both sides of the aisle who the sociology was naturally to work together. But I used to go up and brief in my role in the first Bush administration because of the role I played with Baker, but even because of the way things worked at that time, there was a very close relationship between the White House and the State Department, the NSC, and the upper reaches of the State Department. So I did a lot of briefing on the Hill at that time, but then when under Clinton, I did the same thing. And I had a large number, during Clinton's time, there were a very large number of Republicans that on a very natural, consistent basis, I would go up and brief. And it was not even considered an issue, it was considered a given.
Well, that actually does, in a way, begin to segue into the book, because it's a book about leadership. Yeah. And obviously you were exposed to a pretty impressive group of leaders, I think, over the course of your career as a diplomat and a public servant, rather than as an historian. So, for those of you who haven't yet read it, first, it's a wonderful book, and I really do commend it to you. You and David have done a very interesting thing. You've taken, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, what you're interested in is the decisions facing Israel now with regard to the conflict with the Palestinians, not so much really with the wider Arab world, because that's in a very different place than it was even 10 years ago. But the way you've decided to approach it is by writing about 4 Israeli leaders, 4 Israeli prime ministers eventually, David Ben-Gurion, the founding prime minister of Israel, Menachem Begin, who had been his great opponent and is the first Likud prime minister, Yitzhak Rabin, subsequently becomes a kind of martyr, and Ariel Sharon. And of course, the thing that I found so striking about this, and of course this is why you did it that way, is these were men who we also associate with war. I mean, that's actually, for many people, that's the primary association. Rabin, the chief of staff, Ben-Gurion, the founder of the Israel Defense Forces, Sharon himself a war hero, Ben-Gurion, the leader of a pretty violent underground movement during the period before Israel's independence. So why did you guys do it this way?
Well, it's interesting that we were looking at, the premise of the book is that Israel faces a very fateful choice, not because 2 states is available anytime soon, because 2 states is not available anytime soon. And even if you had a left-wing Israeli government, you wouldn't have a 2-state outcome anytime soon, because the Palestinians are divided between Hamas and Fatah, because they're divided between the West Bank and Gaza, because in the West Bank there's a looming succession with Abu Mazen being president of the Palestinian Authority, being 84 years old and someone who smokes a lot and isn't in great health. Everyone around him is positioning themselves for succession, and succession periods are never characterized by periods of moderation or accommodation. You have to prove who's more pure. So 2 states is not available anytime soon, but that doesn't mean that Israel doesn't face a fateful choice, because if it stays on the path it's on and it keeps building outside of the settlement blocks, which are roughly 85 to 90% of all the Israeli settlers live on about 5 to 6% of the West Bank closest to the Green Line. And the concept of settlement blocks is actually something I developed in the spring of 2000 before we went to Camp David, because we were looking at, all right, how do we come up with a border? How do we deal with the issue of settlers? And we came up with the concept of settlement blocks, where the vast majority of settlers live, and territorial swaps to compensate for these blocks. So the idea is, if Israel keeps building outside the blocks, sooner or later you get to the point where you won't be able to physically separate Israelis from Palestinians, and then it's only a 1-state outcome. And when it's a 1-state outcome, then it's 1 state for 2 peoples. Leaving aside the fact that Palestinians will then say, okay, if it's 1 state for 2 peoples, why not 1 person, 1 vote? And if you think BDS was a problem, that's child's play compared to what this will create. So with that as backdrop, the reason I say, and David and I understood this to be a fateful decision, is because the political weight of the settler movement is real. And it's not going to be a simple choice for any Israeli leader. This takes political courage and wisdom. And so we thought, all right, let's look at those Israelis who made very big decisions that were hard decisions, but they made them anyway. And can the lessons for leadership from those 4 provide guidance and maybe inspiration to Israel's leaders today? And so that was kind of the going-in position. And we evolve a little bit because the book actually opens with Sharon and me having lunch, and Sharon saying to me that all his successors are politicians, meaning they will make political choices first, they won't put the country first. And so in the concluding chapter, we not only go through to explain the nature of the demographic problem and why this can't be wished away, but also why the answer to it that comes from the settler movement is not one that solves the problem for Israel. And what are the steps that Israel has to take on the one hand, but also what is it the U.S. could do to make it easier politically for a leader to take on these decisions? So the real reason for selecting these 4 was we wanted to look at those leaders who made what were big, hard decisions, where they made the choice because they saw the consequences for Israel of not making those choices.
So could you just itemize for us, what are the decisions that each of those leaders made?
So the ones that we we didn't go through all their decisions. And by the way, we don't suggest that the four of these were angels by any stretch of the imagination, but that we do see that they always put the country first. So the big decision for Ben-Gurion was to declare the state. And I can go through just one story, I will in a second if you like, that explains just how difficult this decision was, and that it took really the force of his personality and his just sheer will to be able to do it. In Begin's case, it's a decision to do Camp David, the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, where he establishes what he knows will be a precedent, that once you withdraw from all of the Sinai, it's going to be hard not to replicate that in other agreements, but also that his decision to do autonomy for the Palestinians, which brought him into complete conflict with those who had been his closest comrades, and people who were in the underground with him together, and the people that really had, with whom he shared really an unbreakable kind of bond, and yet it was broken over his decision to do this, and he knew it would be. In the case of Rabin, to make the decision to do Oslo and to deal directly with Arafat, which for everybody who remembers the picture of him having to be coaxed into shaking Arafat's hand at the White House, this was a reflection of Rabin, who was, by the way, the most honest leader, also intellectually honest leader I've ever dealt with. The only one who would ever say to me, "Dennis, you were right and I was wrong." I can tell you, nobody else I either worked for or dealt with ever put it quite that way.
Professors don't do that either, I can tell you.
It's funny how that goes.
Yeah.
And Sharon, the decision that Sharon makes to withdraw from Gaza. And here again, this is the guy who built all the settlements, and this is the only one who's ever really dismantled them. And it meant taking on the very constituency that he had championed. So each of them took really big, hard decisions, but they took them because in their mind, you can debate it, but in their mind, this is what the state required.
So let me just, of course, Begin, with Ben-Gurion, it's a kind of affirmative decision, an assertive decision to create the state, even though things did not look propitious. But for the other three, in which cases it's all about withdrawal in return for peace.
Right.
Do you interpret, I guess what I want to get at is your understanding of what leadership meant, and how they understood leadership. Was it some change in their personalities, some almost repudiation of where they had been before, or do you see more continuity in the fundamental character? Because part of the charm of the book is it really gives this very nice, complete biographies of each of these four individuals, which are not actually always familiar to most of us who follow the Middle East.
Right.
So which is it?
Well, there really is an evolution. There's a journey. Each of them goes through a journey. Ben-Gurion the decision is different from the others that follows, and he is somewhat different in terms of the process he undergoes, because what drives him through his life is to end Jewish homelessness. And he's in a different place than the others, although he and Begin share something, because they both came from outside, and they're both imbued with a very strong sense of the need for moral legitimacy. It guides each of them. With Rabin and Sharon, they were born in Palestine. They knew no other home. They never questioned whether they had a right to be there. With Ben-Gurion and Begin, there is they need to justify the legitimacy of the cause. And it's different for two guys who end up spending their life in the military, and for reasons that are both very heavily influenced by their experiences in the 1948 war, the War of Independence. But I would say in Begin, what they all have in common is a profoundly strong pragmatic streak. Even if they're different, Ben-Gurion and Begin are very different ideologically, but Begin has the capacity to adjust his ideology when he sees that the moment demands it. Ben-Gurion is someone who is focused constantly on trying to create a set of circumstances that can work, but as he makes he declares after 48, we could have taken all the land to the Jordan River. But then we would have been a minority in our state, and it was better to have less land and be a majority. This goes back to He Accepts Appeal Commission recommendation in 1937. Again, quite controversial at that time within the issue of the Jewish community in Palestine. In the case of Rabin, he has a view of the Palestinians. He and Sharon, interestingly enough, they have a view of the Palestinians that they represent a national identity. Neither one of them thinks for long parts of their careers that a Palestinian state can be reconciled with Israeli security. So, Rabin looks at it through the lens that it needs to be a kind of Jordanian-Palestinian state, and Sharon looks at it through the lens for a long time that Jordan should be Palestine. And so much so that in Sharon's case, he is the only member of the General Staff in 1970 when Black September takes place and the Nixon administration, really Kissinger, asks the Israelis to mobilize their forces on the Golan Heights after Syria sends 300 tanks into Jordan. He's the only one of the General Staff who does not want to intervene on behalf of Jordan. And his argument at the time is, look, if the Palestinian, if the Arabs, if their state becomes Jordan, we'll have a border dispute with them. But if that's not the case, we'll have a kind of existential dispute or conflict with them. I mean, it's a very interesting debate that he has with the other members of the General Staff. So all of them go through a kind of interesting evolution, and what wasn't necessarily thinkable to them at one point becomes thinkable because they weigh everything. One of the, in answer to your question, Elliot, I think one of the things that's striking for me, even though they're very different people, and ideologically as well, they come to define leadership remarkably similarly. I mean, Sharon talks about the solitude of the leader. And what he means by it is, when you're the leader, when you have to make decisions, you're all alone. You don't share it with anybody else. You bear the burden of this. It's on your shoulders, and it's also your responsibility. All of them feel it's our responsibility to make decisions, not to defer them, not to leave them for our successors. It's on us, and they're each of them has an instinct to assume responsibility. They all see decision-making in a remarkably similar way. They all believe that, you have to recognize the cost of action, but you also have to recognize the cost of inaction, the cost of not acting. And that's true in each of these cases. It's quite remarkable in terms of Ben-Gurion. When Ben-Gurion makes a case, there's a pivotal meeting on May 12, 1948, when they're deciding what to do. Ben-Gurion is sort of hit by a series of whammies in this meeting. That this is the Provisional Council has 13 members, but only 10 can be there for this decision. 2 can't get out of Jerusalem because it's still under siege. 1 is in the States. So there's 10 there. The first thing that happens is, as he convenes the meeting, he gets a report that 120 Jews have been massacred in Gush Etzion, and the Arab Legion, meaning of Transjordan, has taken part. Gets a report back from Moshe Sharet, who's gone to see George Marshall, and George Marshall, basically says, don't declare a state, huge mistake. Maybe you've had some recent military successes. Don't get intoxicated with that. Accept a ceasefire and a trusteeship. And Sharet is saying, look, maybe we could accept a ceasefire, but we need a commitment from you. So if it's for 90 days, we get a commitment you'd recognize the state after that. And he says, I won't do that. Let's just have a ceasefire now. I think trusteeship's the right thing, but let's not, we don't have to debate the other issue now, but let's just have a ceasefire. He comes back and reports this again to the meeting. So the U.S. is not going to support us if we declare a state. Golda Meir has just come back from being dressed up as a Bedouin woman to see King Abdullah in Amman. After the partition plan was declared, was voted on November 29, 1947, she goes to see Abdullah, and Abdullah is all keen on the partition plan. Okay, you'll have the Jewish state, and we'll will be the Arab state. So he sees he's going to have Jordan on both sides of the river. And then if those three are not enough, so then when he turns to Yigal Yadin and Israel Galili, who are the two leaders of the new IDF, and they report on the situation, and they say, look, between 30 and 40% of our soldiers don't even have pistols. We need more time. So, ceasefire would give us time to do this. And so the weight of all the arguments is, don't do this. And he comes back, I would say brilliantly. It's not that he's indifferent to what they're saying, but he also sees the trap in it. And he says, look, if we have this ceasefire that you talk about, tell me who it's imposed on. Is it imposed on the Egyptians? Is it imposed on the Arab Legion? Is it imposed on the Syrians? Is it imposed on Iraq? It'll be imposed only on us. So their arms will seep into Palestine. If we have a state, then we can get arms from the outside. If we're under trusteeship, we will not. It'll be blocked. So this is not a ceasefire that works for us, number one. Number two, he says, the British are leaving. The moment they leave, we have a pretext. We can declare the state then. So we accept this ceasefire. All the arguments against doing this will still be there. And we won't have the same pretext. We will have lost the time. The momentum that would exist for us, and because we have this relationship with the Jews in the diaspora, they will provide a kind of support for us. But if we settle into this trusteeship, the arguments will become stronger and stronger that why would you run the risk of producing a conflict? And he ends up persuading everybody, even though he knows the cost will be quite high. They lose 1% of their population in this war. So he knows the cost is quite high. And I could replicate these arguments with each of the four. But that's what you see with each of the four. They define leadership in a way that it's not only that the buck stops with them, but they see that leadership requires looking ahead, looking around the corner. It requires understanding what's important and being focused on what is most important. It's not that they were apolitical, they weren't, but by the same token, their capacity to decide what's important for the state was something that was consistent with all of them. And they're quite poignant when they speak about it, because that's also part of the way they define leadership. They have a responsibility to explain what they're doing.
So what you're describing is a kind of combination of intellect and courage, really, which is that's a very powerful lesson. I think not even if you're completely uninterested in the Middle East. Right. So let me ask one last question, and then I'm going to throw the floor open for questions. Okay, so you said the circumstances are not propitious right now for a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But I am curious. So, what would be the big courageous decision now?
The big courageous decision now probably has the following elements in it. One, stop building outside the settlement blocks so that you don't pass the tipping point where you can no longer separate, and that will be deeply resisted. Number one, that's the hardest part of it. I think number two is declare that to the east of the security barrier, there won't be Israeli sovereignty, even if there have to be arrangements that meet Israeli security. Three is to open up Area C. This goes back to what I helped to negotiate, what are known as areas A, B, and C in the West Bank. A and B together, A is an area where the Palestinians have essentially security and civil responsibility. B, they have civil responsibility, but only responsibility for local law and order. The Israelis have overriding responsibility on security. And Area C is 60% of the West Bank, where the Israelis retain complete control. Open up Area C for real Palestinian economic activity, because the reality is, without that, this is a fundamental hinterland for the Palestinians if they're going to have any economic viability. Mm-hmm. A lot of the minerals, most of the minerals in the West Bank are found there. Phosphate is found there. most of the mining that takes, actually all of the mining that takes place, stonemasonry, which is an important industry, all of the raw material, all the mines are in Area C, and any effort to build a tourist industry is also in Area C. So open that up for Palestinians, open it up for housing for Palestinians, open it up for industrial zones for Palestinians. The combination of this is a really hard slog. I mean, this is a hard decision, not just because you're no longer building outside the blocks, but the fact is for those who basically want to annex Area C, which is where most of the settler movement is, they will resist this very strongly. Now, I don't think, if the choice is, if you try to present this and say, look, we're going to do this because we're going to have peace tomorrow, no one in Israel will believe it. It's not an accident that the election in 2015 and now the two elections in 2019, the main opposition parties, they weren't out there talking about peace because you have to understand that the Second Intifada, after Camp David and the failure of the Clinton parameters, with an Israeli government that was more forthcoming than any in its history in terms of how far they were prepared to go, that killed the peace camp in Israel. And then the withdrawal from Gaza, further cemented the idea that withdrawal is something that doesn't produce peace, it doesn't produce security, it produces more violence. It produces rockets and tunnels. So you can't sell this as do this as a step towards peace. It isn't to say that you couldn't take advantage of this from a diplomatic standpoint to put the onus on Palestinians, to produce something from the Arabs in response, to get the Europeans and others to support what the Israelis have done and make it clear that the responsibility for responding is on the other side. But it is to say you're not going to have two states anytime soon, but you're doing this so that Israel is able to retain its character. And it's a hard sell also from the other standpoint that what I'm describing, it's real in terms of affecting Israel's identity over time, but it's far more abstract than 130,000 Hezbollah rockets and Iran embedding itself in Syria and ISIS in the Sinai and rockets and tunnels from Hamas in Gaza. That's very concrete. So it takes a leadership that's prepared to explain it, much like these four go to great lengths to explain what they're doing and why they're doing it. By the way, when Begin is explaining his autonomy plan in the Knesset, and he's getting catcalls from his base, he says, "We will not be Rhodesia." All of these guys, they have a clear sense of what Israel requires to be who it is and what it is. And so this will take courage to take these steps. I do think a national unity government would find it easier to do it because you create more of a built-in consensus. But it requires explaining the nature of what is at stake and why, if you continue on the current path, each of these tactical decisions you make today by continuing to build ends up having a strategic consequence.
Yeah. Fascinating. Okay, let me throw the floor open. We have, actually, I don't know whether we have microphones there and there, which I think I'd like to ask people to use. I would like to ask you to identify yourself and to ask a question rather than make a statement. You can tell I have plenty of experiences of discussions of the Middle East, so I'll just ask people to make sure that they're actually asking questions. So the floor is open. Laura. You're going to have to either speak up or use the microphones.
So I think the book hasn't been translated into Hebrew yet. It will be. The book will come out in Israel late December, early January, and it'll be easier to weigh it, the response then. So far, the response is extremely positive, but it's positive from people I might predict would be positive. So I think the real issue here is what the more general reaction will be. I made the point a little earlier. We're raising an issue that, for most Israelis, is more abstract than what they face. And they're also facing a reality that up until now, the right wing has tried to deny it's a problem. They use two arguments. One is that the demographic argument's not real, and the other argument is that basically we can be fine with limited autonomy for the Palestinians. And in the concluding chapter, we take on both of those. I'll give you just two quick snapshots of the arguments and take them on. Maybe the easiest way to highlight the demographic issue. In 1986, the ratio of Jews to Arabs in Gaza, Israel, and the West Bank was 63-37. 63% Jews, 37% Arab. Now, 1986 was before the big Soviet emigration to Israel. So you had, from 89 to 92, you had about 1 million Jews from the Soviet Union and Russia immigrate to Israel. So today, not counting Gaza, because the Israelis got out of Gaza, not counting Gaza, and counting all the additional Jews who came from the Soviet Union and Russia, the ratio today between Israel and the West Bank is 61-39. Okay, so that kind of tells you what the reality is. Now, even, by the way, if you just said, let's just say that the ratio is going to be 6-4. Well, that already is one state for two people. If you're going to stay in the West Bank and have one state, if one state becomes, the only issue that's out there for political discussion, and two states is taken off the table, well, then the Palestinian position is going to be, okay, fine, one person, one vote. And then what does Israel do? Does it have one law for everybody, or does it have two different kinds of laws? And that latter would obviously transform Israel. There are those who, interestingly enough, before this election, there were a number of people who were beginning to make this case. And I did publish an article in Israel Hayom the week before the election, where I kind of made this point and talked about the book. And I did get kind of interesting feedback on it. So I think when there's more of an effort to make this an issue and not disguise it, it becomes, I think it will be joined. There have been polls taken in Israel when they're asked about to use sports separation from the Palestinians. The polls are like 70%. So I do think this is an issue that if it gets joined, it's one thing. The right has wanted to say we don't have to deal with it, not just because of demographics, but because we can give limited autonomy. The problem with that is it's not just that the Palestinians won't accept it, but the presumption is somehow they'll accept defeat. And as you know, one thing about the Palestinian national movement has been characterized by one thing above all else: defiance. Now, and I often say, defiance and rejection and resistance has unfortunately come at great cost to them. So maintaining that posture becomes one that is, in my mind, self-destructive, but it's characterized their movement. So the idea that they'll just submit now ignores their whole history. And as I said, if it becomes one person, one vote, which is what the mantra will be, and you're already seeing it with those under 30, that's what the polling suggests among the Palestinians. And I took part in a panel in London with Mohammed Dakhlan, he said, look, if the Israelis are not interested in two states, I prefer it, but if they're not interested in two states, then fine, just equal rights. I mean, that's going to become the mantra. So you can't deny that. You can't pretend it doesn't exist. And I do think it's an issue that will become joined in Israel, especially as you have some leaders. And I think Gantz is one of those. I know Gantz and Ashkenazi are quite aware of this. I think Lapid is as well. And we'll see. I do think, I mean, look, anybody who says they know exactly how the current situation is going to play out is kidding themselves or kidding you. But I think it's going to be pretty hard. I think there's going to be enormous pressure not to go to a third election. And I mean, if anything is actually going to happen, my guess is, like in most negotiations, it'll be 1 minute to midnight when it becomes clear that the cost of going to a third election is too high, and somehow they'll figure a way out of this. And I do think the fact that there are hearings for the Prime Minister on October 2nd, 3rd, will also, on possible indictment, will weigh heavily in affecting the climate.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Sam David Offcore. I'm a second-year MA student here. My question is going off your last answer to Dean Cohn's question about leadership and how these problems will need to be solved by leaders who take a courageous decision and then have to explain it to their people. In this day and age, though, that seems really difficult. And if we see in our country, in Israel, throughout the world, the ability of the people to listen and understand that decision doesn't seem like it's there. So I guess my question is, looking at these historical models, how do we update that for the political moment that we're currently in, and that doesn't seem to be dissipating anytime soon?
Look, it's a really interesting question, because we're also living in a kind of era where populism is sort of it seems to be the coin of the realm in too many places. And populism, almost by definition, means you appeal to this popular sentiment as opposed to leading what the attitudes ought to be. It's also a built-in rejection of the other, the defining characteristic of it. So, hence the title of the book, Be Strong and of Good Courage. I mean, when you say be strong, I mean, in a sense, the premise of this book is Israel needs to be strong, especially in this neighborhood. It needs to be strong. What I like to say about the Middle East, if you're not strong in the Middle East, you're not vulnerable, you're dead. So you have to be strong. But of good courage means also be wise. And, I think we're in an era where you have to be prepared to take on those who represent these kind of populist instincts that are more a response to the kind of sentiment of, I mean, this is maybe too strong a term, but kind of the sentiment of those who feel the most threatened and are angry. And so it's easy to appeal to them by playing on their anger. But when you're playing on their anger, in the end, you're creating greater division. You're not addressing the real issues that are at hand, including the issues that make them angry and fearful in the first place. And so I just think it requires leaders to stand up and to take it on and to explain the reality and not to shy away from it. I'll cite, as I said, these four are not angels, but they have this capacity to stand up and say what is necessary. Sharon, when he makes a speech to the Knesset on disengagement, it's an unbelievably poignant speech. He gets up and he says, this is the hardest thing I've ever had to do, much harder than my sending soldiers into battle knowing those who wouldn't return. Much harder than having to talk to the families of those who didn't return. That was, as you know, hard, but this is excruciating because I sent these people. I sent people to settle. I watched them raise their families. I know what it means to uproot them. It's the hardest thing I've ever had to do, but the state requires it. My responsibility to the state requires me to take this step, and here's why. And in a lot of ways, that's what we're looking for. I think what we need in terms of leaders today will explain, I know why you're angry. I know why you're fearful. And here's how we're going to address what produces it. And not by appealing to the basest instincts, but by appealing to, all right, what can we do that addresses this, but also how do we do it in a way that is consistent with who we are and what our values are. And I think the truth is that's what real leadership is.
Hi, I'm James Byers. I'm a second-year student here as well. I have a question for you about leadership on the macro level. Looking at the situation in the Middle East today, but specifically to Israel in this sort of critical moment they're in, what can the United States do to assist Israel with maybe helping to push them to these difficult decisions or supporting them through these difficult decisions?
Yeah. Well, we do take that on in the last chapter. There are a number of things I think that we could do. What you're trying to do from a standpoint of making it politically easier is producing some benefits from us that are sufficiently strategic in character that a prime minister and a leadership can then say, this is hard, but we're gaining things that matter to us in a fundamental strategic sense. So what are the things that the U.S. could do? Particularly if Israel takes what I was describing. I mean, the steps I was describing were you stop building outside the blocks, you declare there'll be no Israeli sovereignty to the east of the barrier, you open up Area C for Palestinians. One other thing I would suggest is don't build in the Arab neighborhoods of East Jerusalem, because that's, again, part and parcel of being able to preserve separation as an option. So what could we do? Well, a smart diplomacy right now would have the Israelis put that in our pocket so we could then use it to try to extract things, responses from Arab leaders, by the way, who, especially given the convergence of strategic interest at this point, they see Israel right now as the key, all the key Sunni Arab leaders look at Israel as the main bulwark, not only against Iran and the Shia militias, but against the Muslim Brotherhood and Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And so they do a lot under the table with them now, way beyond anything that was even imaginable before. And that's not going to go away. But, if they had something to point to that Israel was doing that could justify their putting some of this above the table, that would also create more political tailwind for an Israeli prime minister. For example, let's say that the Saudis would send a delegation of government officials to Israel to discuss responses to common threats. In a context where Israel has just taken steps that are demonstrably hard for Israel, it becomes easier for them to contemplate a step like that. We could get the Europeans to be pushing them to do it as well on the grounds that Israel has taken a step. You can cross some thresholds because the Israelis are crossing thresholds. Other things I would do would relate to making it clear that if Israel has taken this initiative, it doesn't have to be taking other initiatives. And that it's really, again, it will be up to the Palestinians to have to reciprocate in some fashion. Give commitments to the Israelis about blocking anti-Israeli resolutions in the Security Council. A combination of taking steps that would give, that look like real gains for Israel and protect Israel. There are other things that are more controversial that we could do. For example, let's say that the Israelis put this in your pocket and you go to the Arabs and say, look, if you aren't prepared to take these kinds of steps, and you go to the Palestinians as well, and you say, look, we would be prepared, if the Israelis take these steps, to acknowledge that the blocks will be part of Israel. The actual borders will still have to be actually negotiated, but we'll commit to the idea that the blocks will be part of Israel. Now, again, this is something you should, especially with the Arabs, if you're going to be able to get them to take steps in public towards Israel, and they say, well, don't do that because that'll make it harder for us to defend this, then you don't do it. But it's part of a consultation where you use what Israel has given you as a lever diplomatically to be able to do more. So those are the kind of things that serve as examples of what could be done if the Israelis were doing this, and that would make it politically easier to sell this within Israel.
Yeah. There's a microphone wandering over to you. I think we have time for one, maybe two more.
Hello, my name is Dennis Murphy. I'm a second-year student. I think that might be almost everyone until the last one. My question has to do with demographic pressures.
Yeah.
So Israel at the moment has the choice, has the option. But moving ahead, it appears as though that might be increasingly taken away from Israel. not in the least because of opinion among Israel's allies in the West.
Yeah.
So in Europe and in the United States, it seems to be very clear that trends are turning towards a camp that Israel seemed to abandon. What is the conscious awareness in Israel of this, and how is that affecting its development moving forward? Thank you very much.
It's a really good question. Again, partly, I'll go back to what I was saying before. There's partly been a denial that this is really taking place, and I would say part of the reason for that is, first of all, Europe is portrayed as sort of a hopeless case, and that that they'll be opposed to Israel regardless of what Israel does. Even if it makes concessions, they'll be opposed anyway. The states are different, but I think the combination of Trump and, at least until recently, his relationship with Netanyahu, the feeling was, well, we're okay with the U.S. And I think there was the sense that Israel is running the risk of losing its nonpartisan character here has not really been absorbed in Israel at the moment, partly because I think that Netanyahu has presented himself as someone who really understands the United States, and therefore he can manage it. And that has it has helped to diminish, I think, the sense that there could be a loss here. When I say, look, if one state's the only, and by the way, what I'm saying here, I do an annual briefing of the Israeli cabinet, and in June 30th, I made these very points to Netanyahu and the cabinet. And I said, you may not accept my prescription, but if one state is the only thing that's part of the political discourse, if you lose the ability to separate, so that's also the reality, not just the discourse, then you're going to face this political freight train that's going to hit you. And when it's one state, one person, one vote, that's going to resonate even in the United States. You're not going to find big constituencies here that are going to say, gee, that's wrong. And I think I think I had an effect on some, but it's not really been part of the discussion, the public discussion within Israel. I think it is. I think those. I think the people. I think within blue-white, there's more of awareness of it, meaning the Gantz-led party. But I think even Netanyahu understands it himself, and would have to figure out a way to try to deal with it. So far, I think that he's not dealt with it, and I don't think that there's going to be the luxury of not dealing with it. Now, if we end up with a national unity government, that will make it easier because Netanyahu became a kind of symbol of partisanship here. And it goes back to the decision he made to do the speech to the Congress against the Iran nuclear deal before it was realized. I mean, this was 3 months before the JCPOA was actually completed. Many Democrats on the Hill still hold that against him, that he came and he did a speech in the Congress against the policy of the American president. And for many, that crossed the line. And the embrace of Trump just adds to it because Trump is a polarizing figure. So if you have someone who is not seen here as polarizing or as partisan the same way, and Gantz, when he came and he gave his speech at AIPAC, he gave the whole thrust of the speech was about nonpartisanship, Israel's stake in being an American interest, not a Republican or a Democratic interest. And his pitch is about national healing within Israel and closing, not accentuating the divisions. So I think the explanation for why it really hasn't yet had a kind of serious discussion in Israel, I think, is partly just what the politics have been, but those politics may also be changing right now.
Okay, I think we have time for one last quick question and a quick response, and then off to sign books.
Hi, Ambassador. Thanks so much. This is a really interesting conversation. I'm Ben Gilbert. I'm a strategic studies student here. In hindsight, is there anything the United States could have done that would have prevented the second Intifada? Thank you.
Could have prevented.
The second Intifada.
The short answer is, I don't think so, because look at when the second Intifada took place. The second Intifada took place, it began the end of September of 2000. And I can tell you, to put this in context, I think that Arafat made a decision. It had nothing to do with Camp David. It had everything to do with the Israeli withdrawal, unilateral withdrawal from Lebanon. The worst meeting I ever had with him was Israel withdrew on May 22nd of 2000. And it was for Barak, who was fulfilling a campaign pledge. He spent the first year trying to do a deal with Syria. In the end, it didn't happen, though I think we were quite close at one point. He withdrew unilaterally, and the worst meeting I ever had with Arafat was right after that. Arafat was a guy who never swore. In this meeting, he was using four-letter words and not repeating himself. He couldn't, I mean, he was so angry, he was almost spitting. And he was saying, look at how this makes me look. You know, I'm being vilified by Hezbollah and Iran, and they're saying the Israelis throw me crumbs and Hezbollah gets everything. One of the things the Hezbollah did right after the Israelis withdrew is they opened up all the jails in the south. And so, you know, the issue of releasing prisoners was a big deal. I think he, at that point, made a decision, okay, you know, this is what the Israelis respond to. We'll do our own violence. And, you know, and then they'll give us more than we otherwise would have gotten. And that's, I think he decided he was going to engineer this. And I say that also because I went back and forth between the two negotiating delegations here, and what was supposed to be one last session, and because I'd already said we were going to probably present what would become the Clinton parameters in the beginning, basically the beginning of October. The same day, with 3 days of meetings with the two delegations at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Pentagon City. And on the third day, Sharon had already been up to the Temple Mount, to the Haram, and back because of the time difference. It wasn't even a discussion with the Palestinians on that day. The night before, we'd worked out some arrangements between them and Shlomo Ben-Ami, who was the Minister of Interior here, because he was part of the negotiation team. At the end of this, I laid out to the two sides where I saw the bridges between their positions and said I was going to recommend to the president that we make a proposal that was reflecting, obviously, what I was describing. Literally an hour after I finished with him, I got a call from George Tenet, who asked me, who had just seen Mohammed Dahlan, who was part of the Palestinian team, and he said, what did you tell him? Because Mohammed said there's going to be a deal. So I told him what I said. 90 minutes later, I got a call from Danny Yatom, the chief of staff to Barak, who said, look, the prime minister knows what you said, he's okay with it, but we have all sorts of information that Arafat is planning widespread violence throughout the West Bank and Gaza tomorrow, using the Sharon visit, you know, that had taken place that morning as kind of the pretext. And everything we're passing them about not doing it, they're not responding. So you need to go to them. And so we did. And basically said to them, look, we're not, you know from your guys that we're prepared to present something that actually goes well beyond what we discussed and presented at Camp David. But we're not going to do it if there's violence. And they did it anyway. So I think he pretty much, I think it was the way he reacted after Lebanon, and I think that's what produced the second Intifada. I mean, look, at this point, he already knew, even after Camp David. He leaves Camp David, goes back to Gaza, and he's going back as a hero because he defied us. Again, it gets back to this notion of defiance as part of almost the idiom. At the same time he was defying and showing how he stood up to us and to the Israelis at Camp David, he sends a letter to the president saying, you know, at Camp David we made more progress than at any point in the history of this conflict. Let's have another summit. You know, so whatever he was defying in public, in private, he was, you know, he's saying, gee, we gained a lot, but I think his view was, this is great. I can do violence, and the Israelis will give me more, and after that next summit, maybe do the summit after the violence, after that, then we'll be able to conclude something. So I don't believe that there was anything we could have done that would have been different. Were there some things the Israelis could have done along the way? Yeah, because Barak made a number of commitments that he didn't fulfill, and that shouldn't have been the case.
Great. Well, thank you very much. We're going to go outside now. I guess I just wanted to say that I think one of the things that SAIS in particular has always appreciated is the use of history to illuminate the problems of not only the past but the future. And this book really does a brilliant job of it, and I commend it to all of you. Dennis, thank you. Let's go sign some books.
All right, thank you.